Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and welcome back to part 2 of our lecture regarding World War II abroad. Now, we left off with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and some of the reasons why that Mexican Americans would join the war effort in such large numbers, including some discrimination as well. But realize that Mexicanos and other Latinos would heavily participate in the war abroad through military enlistment. Again, 500,000 are going to serve in the armed forces. They will participate in the beach invasions in both Northern Africa and Sicily. They will take part in the storming of Normandy on D-Day. They will take part in the island hopping campaigns in the Pacific against the Japanese Imperial Army. And some of them would even train for the dropping of the atomic bomb. In every area of this war, in every theater and every facet, Mexican Americans played their part. I want to highlight just a couple of the major ones for you, just so you can understand how clearly and how integrated this was. Let's start in the Pacific. So the Pacific theater is the specific battles against the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean, hence the name Pacific Theater. And so the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the was only part one of a larger, more ambitious plot to attack American bases throughout the Pacific, places like the Philippines and Guam. That was called the Southern Operation. Now, in the Philippines, our military there was headed up by General Douglas MacArthur. You may remember him in such events as the Bonus Army, massacre. Well, he's in charge of the Philippines. And this guy, after hearing about the attack on Pearl Harbor, doesn't do a single thing to mobilize or prepare the troops, naively believing that the Japanese couldn't possibly be planning an attack against the Philippines. And privately will later admit that it was incompetence that would lead to the situation. And so due to this incompetence, there would be a second surprise attack, a second Pearl Harbor, if you will, at Manila Bay on December 8th. Yes, the next day. So even though MacArthur hears about the attack 12 hours after it took place, he does nothing. And on December 8th at Manila Bay, you see highlighted on the map, there will be a second Pearl Harbor that will include aerial bombing and torpedoing ships, etc. Mac's inaction, or lack of action, will lead to the defeat of American forces in the Philippines, giving Japan a wider range of air superiority. The Japanese would follow the aerial bombing with the land invasion, forcing MacArthur and his troops onto the Bataan Peninsula. You see pictured on the map. But due to his incompetence and errors, his inability of MacArthur to get supplies to his troops, the American and Filipino troops will be forced to surrender to the Japanese military. Some 80,000 prisoners of war, 12,000 U.S. troops. Now you have to realize that the Japanese are in a foreign country, the Philippines, far away from their own island. They are not prepared to take care of 80,000 prisoners of war. Plus, Japanese warrior culture found surrender to be cowardly and undeserving of humane treatment. And thus, the Japanese forced these POWs to march an 80-mile march beginning in early 1942. This became known as the Bataan Death March, that was punctuated with brutality, executions, untreated wounds, heat exhaustion, lack of food and water. Those who fell behind or begged for food or water were executed on the spot. Those who survived the march would spend the next 40 months in horrific confinements of POW camps. Most would be transported to the Japanese mainland aboard death ships, with most not surviving the journey. Given very little food, water, and even clothing, the men were tortured, malnourished, and riddled with disease. 2/3 would die from disease, starvation, horrendous conditions, and beatings and or murder. More than 11,500 soldiers would die during the 3+ years of confinement. Among those, however, on the Bataan Peninsula, left behind by MacArthur was the 200th and 515th Coast Army Battalion, artillery battalions of the New Mexico National Guard. So the 200th and 515th Coast Artillery Battalions of the New Mexico National Guard. They've been activated and sent to the Philippines. They were forced to partake of the 12-day, 80-mile death march. The vast majority of them were Mexican Americans. The vast majority would die of starvation or beatings due to their 34-month captivity. Of the 1,800 men, 829 would die in battle, while prisoners or immediately after liberation. So almost half are going to die due to their treatment as POWs. Again, the vast majority of these 829 men are Mexican Americans. There's a picture of them right there, along with some of the survivors. Now, things were going bad in the Pacific Theater, very bad. Within 2 days, the U.S. not only got bombed at Pearl Harbor, a severe blow to our military in the Pacific, but also lost the Philippines. And so the plan developed for the Pacific Theater was known as island hopping, led under Admiral Chester Nimitz. Now, the idea was to leapfrog islands. You didn't necessarily have to control every island or every island that Japan controlled, but you needed to leapfrog them and just get closer, gaining strategic bases, getting ever closer to the Japanese mainland with the goal of launching a land assault. And that even if you leapfrogged over a Japanese-controlled island, it didn't matter because you would then be able to cut off their supply chain and basically starve them out. And of course, the goal was to get as close to the mainland as possible, in this case, Okinawa. So after some initial success, they would finally be able to retake the Philippines. When MacArthur had left the Philippines forced to retreat, he would survive and he would come back, promising that he would do so. He did keep the promise. And among the men sent to retake the island from Japanese control was the 158th Regimental Combat Team of the U.S. 6th Army Division. They were known as the Bushmasters. Their motto, cuidado, take care. This was almost exclusively a Navajo Indian and Mexican American unit of the Arizona National Guard. General MacArthur himself would call them, quote, the greatest fighting combat team ever deployed for battle, unquote. And they would be instrumental in retaking the Philippines from Japanese control. In addition, Mexican Americans would take heavy part in the battle for Okinawa, the largest amphibious landing in the Pacific, an 82-day battle that saw 50,000 American casualties and 90,000 Japanese casualties. The mostly Mexican-American infantry known as the Deadeyes, the 96th Infantry Division, would be instrumental in leading this 82-day battle. Including members of the 96th Infantry would also receive the Distinguished Service Cross for bravery. You see on your screen. Also, there was an elite Mexican group. Again, this was pushed by the Mexican government. So this was a Mexican fighter pilot group of Mexican nationals that fought on behalf of the United States, known as the Aztecas, or Las Aguilas Azteca Squadron 201. This is this elite Mexican pilot group, nicknamed the Aztec Eagles, an all-Mexican fighter squadron from the Mexican Air Force, were part of the Mexican Expeditionary Force that helped and aided the Allied war effort. They would be involved in the liberation of the Philippines in 1945 and carry out tactical air support for land troops. So all over the Pacific, in every major battle, Mexican Americans are there. Mexican Americans were also prolific in the European theater of war. Remember, there was two halves of this war. There was the fight against the Japanese. There's also the fight against the Germans, right? So in the European side of thing, there was also a two-pronged, within the European theater, there was also a two-pronged war. The first started by invading northern Africa and then moving up through Italy northward to get Italy out of the war. In this, some of the bravest parts of this was the 88th Infantry Division, the Blue Devils, who fought in North Africa. And then Company E of the 141st Regiment, also known as the 36th Texas Infantry Division, who would fight in combat in Italy. And this group, the Blue Devils, would remain in combat longer than any other American division, consisting almost exclusively of Mexican Americans. Within the 36th Texas Infantry Division, the only all-Mexican American unit of World War II, under the command of a Mexicano himself, Captain Gabriel Navarrete. They were engaged in a full year of combat versus the Nazis in Italy to push German forces out of Rome. The unit would receive 31 Distinguished Service Crosses, 12 Legions of Merit, 492 Silver Stars, 11 Soldiers Medals, and 1,685 Bronze Stars. That was just part one of the invasion of Europe. Part two, of course, was the land invasion of France, Normandy, D-Day. And sure enough, part of that landing group was the 313th Infantry Regiment of the 79th Infantry Division, would land on Utah Beach in Normandy to help liberate France. Now, the majority of this, of course, is all Mexican-American men. And while it is usually traditionally men who will enlist, a small number of Mexicanos will also join the armed forces, though their service record is largely and vastly understudied. Women, however, will join the armed forces usually in other capacities, such as auxiliary groups. Each branch of the military would have their own women's auxiliary corps. This would include Dora Ocampo Quesada, who in 1944 became a registered nurse. She would serve as the first lieutenant in the Nurses Corps. During World War II, she would see service with the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, was stationed at the White Sands Proving Ground, a nuclear first aid station in New Mexico, and later at the San Antonio Air Command Hospital in Texas. She ranked second lieutenant and was honorably discharged in 1946. Later becoming a teacher in 1958, becoming a defender for teacher rights. And again, I'm not trying to discount any other people's service here, but Mexican Americans proportionally would receive more decorations for bravery on the battlefield than any other ethno-racial group involved, receiving 13 Medals of Honor, and not a single case of desertion, mutiny, or treason. This would include Cleto Rodriguez of San Marcos, Texas, pictured on your left. Born in San Marcos, Texas in 1923, he lost his parents at only 9 years old. He would sell newspapers to support his family, often sleeping in the San Antonio Express's newspaper building, so he could wake up early to deliver papers before school. He would serve in both the Army and the Air Force, receiving a Medal of Honor for actions in the Philippines. Rodriguez was the 5th Mexican American to ever earn this honor and one of 14 Texans who would earn it during World War II. And then there was Macario Garcia, Staff Sergeant from Sugar Land, Texas, who would serve in the 4th Infantry Division in Germany. Wounded in action at Normandy in 1944, he would rejoin his unit for an assault on Germany. He received the Medal of Honor for bravery. Given this award in Washington, D.C. by President Truman, But once home, he'd be refused service in a restaurant in Richmond, Texas, because he was, well, Mexican American. All told, more than 40 Latinos would win the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, or take, of course, Francisco Vega. We mentioned him earlier. Remember, he had trouble enlisting in the military. But of course, he will serve bravely during the war itself. Surviving Omaha Beach on D-Day. He survived the Battle of the Bulge in France. He will receive American Defense Service Medal, an American Campaign Medal, a World War II Victory Medal, and the French Presidential Military Decoration, though he will be denied a Medal of Honor himself. Now, we will talk more about how the war officially ends in a future lecture, but for now, please watch the oversimplified World War II video that I'll post on Blackboard for you, because it'll give you a much more detailed account of just the kind of going-ons of this war. But when we come back, we'll talk about what happened on the home front during World War II, because the focus in this lecture was abroad. So when we come back next time, we'll talk about the home front. So until then, take care and bye-bye.